It's just past 1 in the morning in Salt Lake City, Utah. A quiet street, a quiet house, a family asleep behind locked doors. In one bedroom, two sisters share a bed. 14-year-old Elizabeth, her 9-year-old sister Mary Catherine. They are safe, they are home. And then, footsteps, a blade, pressed against a young girl's throat. A voice in the dark, "Get up and come with me, or I will kill you and your family." Within minutes, Elizabeth Smart is gone, taken from her own bed, in her own home, while her parents slept down the hall. How does a stranger walk into a family's home undetected? Where did he take her? Would anyone ever see her alive again? And if they did, what would 9 months of captivity have done to a 14-year-old girl? This is the story of one of the most followed missing person cases in American history, a story of unthinkable cruelty, and of a survivor whose strength would go on to change how this country protects its children. Stay with us, because what happened to Elizabeth Smart, and what she did afterward, is a story you need to hear in full. Before she became a name known across the country, Elizabeth Smart was simply the oldest daughter in a large, close-knit Mormon family in Salt Lake City, Utah. She was 14 years old in the summer of 2002, a talented harpist, a good student, an athlete, and by every account from those who knew her, a warm and gentle kid. Just days before her abduction, she had stood on stage at her middle school's end-of-year awards ceremony, collecting honors for academics and physical fitness. Her parents, Ed and Lois Smart, were proud. Her 5 younger siblings adored her. It was an ordinary, happy life. The kind of life that made what happened next so difficult for her community, and eventually an entire nation, to comprehend. Because the man who would take her wasn't a stranger who broke in through a window. He was someone the Smart family had briefly welcomed into their home. Months earlier, Lois Smart had encountered a panhandler on a Salt Lake City street, a soft-spoken, self-described street preacher who called himself Emmanuel. Moved by his situation, Lois gave him money and, later, hired him for a single day of odd jobs on the family's roof. His real name was Brian David Mitchell. Nobody in the Smart family had any reason to think that brief, well-meaning kindness would come back to haunt them. But Mitchell had taken note of the house, and of Elizabeth. Before we go further into this story, if you haven't already, take a second to hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We cover real cases of mystery, survival, and justice every week, and you won't want to miss what happens next in this one. It happened in the earliest hours of June 5, 2002. Elizabeth was asleep in the bedroom she shared with Mary Catherine. Sometime around 1 in the morning, a man slipped into the house. Investigators would later determine he entered through an unlocked kitchen door and made his way upstairs to the girls' room. Mary Catherine woke first. She would later describe watching a shadowy figure move to Elizabeth's side of the bed. She stayed still, frozen, as the intruder pressed a knife to Elizabeth's throat and ordered her out of bed in a whisper, "Don't make a sound, or he would kill her and her family." Elizabeth, still half asleep, believed at first it might be a bad dream, or her little sister playing a trick. It was neither. She was forced to dress, and was led out of the house and up into the foothills above the city, marched for hours through the darkness to a makeshift camp. Waiting there was Mitchell's wife, Wanda Barzee. Meanwhile, back in the bedroom, Mary Catherine lay frozen with fear. She has said she recognized something about the man's voice, a detail that would not matter for months, but would ultimately become the key that unlocked the entire case. She waited, terrified, before finally running to wake her parents. When Ed and Lois Smart were woken by their 9-year-old daughter, the truth took a moment to register. Elizabeth's bed was empty. A window screen had been found removed. Their daughter was simply gone. Panic set in immediately. Ed Smart called 911. Within minutes, Salt Lake City police were at the house, and by daylight what had happened to one family had become a story every local news station in Utah was reporting. Investigators searched the house for signs of forced entry and interviewed the family. Mary Catherine, still shaken, was gently questioned. But at 9 years old, still processing what she'd witnessed, she wasn't yet able to give investigators the answer that was, in fact, already inside her memory. Search dogs were brought in. FBI agents joined local police within hours. And Ed Smart, in visible anguish, began making public pleas for his daughter's safe return, pleas that would be broadcast around the country in the days that followed. What had begun as a single missing child in one American city was, within 48 hours, becoming a story the entire nation was watching. In the days and weeks after Elizabeth's disappearance, Salt Lake City became the center of one of the largest missing child searches in United States history. Thousands of volunteers combed the foothills and canyons surrounding the city. Search and rescue teams, mounted units, and cadaver dogs worked the surrounding wilderness. The FBI, U.S. Marshals, and local law enforcement coordinated a search effort that, at its peak, drew comparisons to searches for adult fugitives, not missing children. Elizabeth's photograph appeared on flyers across the state and, soon, across the country. National news networks picked up the story. Ed and Lois Smart gave interview after interview, appearing on morning shows and evening news broadcasts, refusing to let their daughter's case fade from public attention. Tip lines were flooded. Investigators would eventually field more than 16,000 leads over the course of the case. Composite sketches were drawn based on witness accounts. Suspects were questioned and released. Dead end followed dead end. By the fall of 2002, Elizabeth Smart's disappearance had become what reporters at the time called the media's latest obsession, a case followed as closely as any in the country. And still, there was no sign of her. In the early months of the investigation, police pursued several leads that ultimately went nowhere, including a man depicted in an early composite sketch who was questioned and later cleared. What investigators did not yet know was that the man responsible had a documented, if brief, connection to the Smart family already on record. The one-day roofing job performed by the panhandler Lois Smart had shown kindness to. That man, Brian David Mitchell, was a self-styled street preacher who had drifted in and out of fringe religious circles, believing himself to be a prophet. His wife, Wanda Barzee, shared his beliefs and, according to later court findings, played an active role in Elizabeth's captivity. It's important to be precise here about what is established fact and what emerged only later through testimony and investigation. At the time, investigators had no confirmed suspect. Mitchell and Barzee had left few traces. It would take a startling coincidence, and the memory of a 9-year-old girl, to change that. In one unsettling development confirmed by court records, Mitchell also attempted, unsuccessfully, to abduct one of Elizabeth's cousins in a separate incident that summer, a crime for which he and Barzee were later separately charged. What followed for Elizabeth Smart was 9 months that she would later describe, in her own words and in her memoir, as a sustained ordeal of captivity, abuse, and psychological control. According to Elizabeth's own later accounts and subsequent court testimony, she was initially kept at a rudimentary campsite in the hills above Salt Lake City, at times tethered by a cable to prevent her escape. She endured repeated sexual assault by Mitchell, with Barzee, according to Elizabeth's testimony, a participant in enforcing her compliance, rather than a source of protection. In September 2002, the couple took Elizabeth by bus to the San Diego, California area, where they continued to live at improvised campsites and survive by panhandling. During this period, she was sometimes brought into public, grocery stores, even a public library, her face obscured by a veil, forced to stay silent while her captors interacted with people around her, people who had no idea they were standing near the most searched-for missing child in the country. In one especially haunting moment later confirmed publicly, police did approach the group during this time, questioning why the veiled, silent young woman with them wouldn't speak. Mitchell explained they were religious guardians protecting his daughter. Barzee, according to Elizabeth's later account, gripped her leg beneath the table as a warning to stay silent. The officers walked away. It is difficult to overstate what this meant. A chance for rescue, present and then gone, without anyone realizing how close they had come. Throughout this period, we know from Elizabeth's own testimony and later public statements that she endured ongoing threats against her family's safety if she attempted to flee or reveal her identity, a form of psychological control that, combined with physical restraint and isolation, kept her from seeking help even when she had opportunities to do so. What Elizabeth Smart endured during these 9 months was, in the years since, described by her as almost impossible to put into words. And yet what stands out, in every account she has since given, is not just the horror of what was done to her, it's the fact that she survived it, and never stopped looking, quietly, for a way home. If this story is affecting you the way it's affected us researching it, take a moment right now to hit that subscribe button and like this video. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like Elizabeth's. Stories of real survival, real resilience, and real justice. Now, let's continue. By October of 2002, the massive public search for Elizabeth had continued for 4 months without a confirmed lead. That month, something shifted. Mary Catherine Smart, the little sister who had witnessed the abduction, suddenly remembered something. She recalled the voice of the man who had taken her sister. And she connected it to a man who had briefly worked at their home the year before, the panhandler her mother had hired for a single day of roofing work, the man who called himself Emmanuel. It was a fragile lead, built entirely on a child's memory of a voice heard once, months earlier, in the dark. But investigators took it seriously. A composite sketch was created based on Mary Catherine's recollection. Frustratingly for the Smart family, law enforcement made the decision to hold that sketch back from the public for several months while they pursued other angles, a decision that, in hindsight, delayed what might have been an earlier resolution. It wasn't until February 2003 that the sketch was finally released to the public and featured on the television program America's Most Wanted. The response was almost immediate. People who knew Mitchell began coming forward. Critically, his own sister recognized the sketch and contacted police, confirming what investigators now suspected. Emmanuel was Brian David Mitchell. The 9-month search for a name had finally produced one. On March 12, 2003, a resident in Sandy, Utah, a suburb just miles from the Smart family home, spotted a trio matching the descriptions now circulating in the media: a man, a woman, and a young woman wearing a veil and a wig. Police were called. Officers approached the group and separated them for questioning. The young woman initially gave a false name, still under the psychological grip of 9 months of captivity and fear. But when directly confronted and asked if she was Elizabeth Smart, she confirmed the truth. 9 months after she was taken from her bedroom at knife point, Elizabeth Smart was alive. The news broke almost instantly, sweeping across every major network in the country. For a case that had, for so many, become a symbol of a nation's worst fears about child abduction, Elizabeth's rescue became something else entirely, proof that these stories can still end in survival. Ed and Lois Smart were notified and rushed to be reunited with their daughter. For a family that had spent 9 months refusing to give up hope, giving interviews, keeping her story alive in the public eye, never allowing the search to go cold, it was the moment they had prayed for, arriving after nearly a year of anguish. For millions of Americans who had followed the case since that first June morning, Elizabeth Smart's rescue offered something rare in stories like this one, an ending rooted not in tragedy, but in hope. Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee were taken into custody at the scene of Elizabeth's rescue. In the days that followed, both were formally charged with multiple felony counts, including aggravated kidnapping, aggravated sexual assault, and aggravated burglary, along with charges tied to the earlier attempted abduction of Elizabeth's cousin. What followed, however, was not a swift resolution. Mitchell's prosecution was delayed for years by repeated competency hearings. Court-appointed evaluators found, on more than one occasion, that Mitchell's professed religious delusions rendered him unfit to stand trial, a legal process that stretched on for the better part of a decade and required Elizabeth herself to testify multiple times. In 2008, a federal grand jury indicted both Mitchell and Barzee on federal kidnapping charges. Barzee reached a plea agreement in 2009, pleading guilty to federal charges and agreeing to cooperate with prosecutors, testimony that would prove significant in the case against her husband. She was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Mitchell's case finally went to trial in federal court in late 2010. On December 10, 2010, more than 8 years after he abducted Elizabeth. A jury found Brian David Mitchell guilty of kidnapping and unlawfully transporting a minor across state lines with intent to engage in sexual activity. In May 2011, he was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in federal prison, with no possibility of parole. He remains incarcerated today. Barzi's path to release was more complicated and more controversial. After completing her federal sentence, she was transferred to a Utah state prison in 2016 to serve time on remaining state charges. In 2018, the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole announced that a review of her sentence had found a calculation error, one that made her eligible for release years earlier than originally expected. She was released on parole in September 2018, a decision Elizabeth Smart publicly and forcefully opposed, calling her former captor a continued threat. What Elizabeth Smart did after her rescue is, in many ways, as remarkable as her survival itself. Rather than retreating from public life, she chose, over time, to become one of the most visible advocates for missing and exploited children in the country. In 2011, she founded the Elizabeth Smart Foundation, an organization dedicated to preventing crimes against children through education and advocacy, and to supporting survivors of sexual abuse and exploitation. She has testified before Congress. She has worked as a contributor and commentator on child safety issues for national media. She earned a degree from Brigham Young University, got married, and built a family of her own. She has also spoken and written publicly, including in her own memoir, about the long process of healing, not shying away from the reality that recovery from trauma of this magnitude is not a single moment, but an ongoing process. What has remained consistent throughout is her insistence that her story not end where her captivity did, in her own words, delivered many times over the years in various forms. What happened to her does not define the whole of who she is. Elizabeth Smart's case did more than capture a nation's attention for 9 months. It changed in tangible ways how America responds to child abductions. Her case became one of the highest-profile early tests of the Amber Alert system, then still relatively new, helping demonstrate both its value and the ways public search efforts, media coverage, and law enforcement coordination could work together in real time. In the years since, her advocacy has directly contributed to strengthened federal and state child safety legislation. Her story also underscored something less technical, but just as important: the role ordinary people play in these cases. It was a family's insistence on keeping the story alive in the public eye. It was millions of people, all across the country, who saw a composite sketch on television and stayed alert. It was, ultimately, a resident in a quiet Utah suburb who recognized something wasn't right and made a phone call. Elizabeth Smart's case remains, more than 2 decades later, one of the most cited examples of why public awareness, media attention, and community vigilance matter. Because in her case, they were the reason she came home. Elizabeth Smart's story began on an ordinary June night, in a bedroom she shared with her little sister, in a home where she should have been safe. It became 9 months of captivity most of us can barely imagine surviving. It became a national search, an agonizing wait, and finally, against every fear her family had carried for 9 months, a rescue. But Elizabeth Smart's story is not defined only by the night she was kidnapped. It is also a story of survival, resilience, and the strength to reclaim one's life. Behind every missing person case is a real human being, and a family waiting, praying, refusing to give up. Elizabeth Smart's case reminds us that even after the worst has happened, there can still be a path forward, and that path is worth fighting for. Do you remember when Elizabeth Smart was rescued? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you want to hear more real stories of mystery, survival, and justice, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new documentary. And as always, thank you for watching.